Thank you. This is also my first Nautical Archaeology Society conference, so sort of following a bit of a trend there. But yeah, today I'm going to be talking to you about some work that's based on an ongoing PhD project with the University of Reading, kindly funded by the SWWDTP, which I've been told I should add. And essentially, I'm going to be talking you through some long-term trends in some of the archaeological finds from the Thames. And I'd like to really begin with a quick overview of sort of the history of some of the debates that have been sort of underway at this time. So, as previous speakers have mentioned, this changes a lot between different archaeological periods. But the River Thames has always been at the forefront, at least within a British context. So, really, this starts very, very early. In 1724, we have the first sort of recorded instance of sort of archaeological scholarship surrounding the Thames, with William Stukely commenting on coins he was attempting to haggle from some shepherds along the river. But essentially, the modern debate really begins in the 1970s with the work of Walter Torbridge in Europe. This sort of makes some real waves in British archaeology and is sort of emulated with studies such as that by Margaret Ehrenberg, looking at Bronze Age metalwork within the Thames. And what these do is these begin to, for the first time, start to piece together objects from the river in terms of their approximate spatial trends. Now, at this time, these are very basic, and the trends amount to as little more as the Thames seems to be a focus of deposition, which now, over time, we've come to see that that is very much true. There's a huge abundance of metalwork to the point that the Thames is often used as the standard which other British rivers are compared to. The very expectation that a river will produce metalwork originally stemmed from the abundance of material flowing through from the Thames. But the debate really sort of modernizes in the 1980s and 1990s with the work of influential figures such as Richard Bradley, who start to comment and interpret these finds and really introduce the votive to non-votive debate. The title of my full PhD project is 3,000 Years of Ritual or Rubbish in the Thames, which again highlights that it's a recurring sort of theme. This interpretation of objects as either votive or non-votive, accidental losses or intentional deposits, is overwhelmingly the focus of all of this scholarship. But in Britain, this has an underlying basis in prehistory. It's Bronze Age and Iron Age studies that really focus on this topic. Romanists and early medieval archaeologists, at least in this early stage of the debate, focus on objects as far more likely to be accidental losses. In the early medieval period, this is usually interpreted to be the result of battles, whereas in the Roman period, it's often just seen as rubbish being dumped near and around settlements. And it's only sort of recently that these different disciplines have begun to sort of communicate and engage, and objects are increasingly within Britain seen as largely votive. The primary argument for that is incredibly simple, and it is simply the quantity of finds recovered from across the Thames region. It's seen as an analogy was used by Richard Bradley in his work on natural places, and that is that if these are all natural losses, then people must have been very clumsy indeed. But to sort of move through, part of the project that I've been working on aims to really combine multiple periods. Now, part of the issue of doing so is that period-specific research likes to branch down and break things into even further subperiods. So this paper will be using sort of the following general period divisions, and I'm sure for many of you that is not specific enough at all. But these largely relate to British periods of objects. The other point to note is that this paper will contain non-metal objects. Metalwork has overwhelmingly been the focus of most previous work on the Thames, any region of the Thames. This is largely due to the fact that we have abundant quantities of it and other materials unlikely to survive. And we'll get into some of the recovery biases in a moment. But it's important to note that this data set does not discriminate by any form of material. This is everything that can be found and generally attributed to the study area that we'll get onto. But the data collection for this project was sort of rather arduous in the sense that there are lots of regional distributions. Previous research tends to be focused on specific counties or areas, and compiling that and putting that all together into one single data set has proven rather difficult. The other issue that that really leads to is the fact of data standardization, which is further compounded by the fact that river finds are a little bit problematic, particularly those from the Thames. And the reason for that largely stems from that antiquarian tradition that I mentioned earlier. So in the sort of late 19th to early 20th centuries, the prospect of collecting material from the Thames really became in vogue amongst Victorian gentlemen. There were bidding wars, auction houses have records of large amounts of disagreements and spats over particular objects that people wanted, as long as it was recorded as from the Thames. They were put into cabinets of curiosities and displayed to friends at dinner. This was sort of fed in turn by the golden age of dredging, which was occurring at the same time. So the River Thames was being used increasingly for navigation. The Thames Conservancy had sort of taken control, and mechanical dredges were being used to lift huge amounts of material for the first time. This was not being done systematically, and fines were certainly not being gathered systematically. So dredgers were being sent any requests. This is poorly recorded. With several volunteers, we've been analysing the archives of the Thames Conservancy. They often do not record where dredges have been, what they have done, where material is deposited, but it is down to there are increasing numbers of fines being recovered by those dredgers. How that find is recovered, how it's recorded, is all down to the chief engineer of that particular dredger. So what we see is clear selectivism for prestigious objects, particularly copper alloy objects, which are likely to have been potentially mistaken for gold, but essentially only objects thought to be worth selling were really recovered and kept. This further sort of exasperates the general sort of focus on metalwork that we see. It means finds like pottery, animal bone, just anything seen as not particularly valuable, or finds that were believed to be modern, say iron finds or early medieval objects, were simply not kept. Finds that were kept, the find spot was often not recorded, or it was so vague as to be archaeologically sort of perilous. Some of this could be between Marlow and Staines, a region of up to about 80 kilometers, or more often, just the Thames. So the majority of finds that have actually been recovered, and it should be noted that approximately 80% of finds from the Middle Thames were recovered during this time, most of which do not have an adequate find spot and can't really be plotted. So we can't really start to say too much about the distribution, where these finds are being deposited, because we simply do not have the data and it is now impossible to recover. I'd now like to introduce the study region. So many of you are broadly familiar with where the Thames is roughly located, but the Middle Thames refers to a very sort of specific section. So where the Thames is approximately 240 kilometers long, the Middle Thames refers to a section between Goring Gap, where the Thames runs through the Chiltern Hills, down to Teddington Lock. It's about 130 kilometers or so. The Thames here is incredibly slow moving. It's characterized as a low energy river system, and it is on the low end of that. So the water here moves between 2.5 to 4 kilometers an hour, contrasting the lower Thames, where the river is tidal, moves between about 10 and 12 miles an hour. It's incredibly slow. It's also rather deep in this region compared to the upper Thames, though not as deep as the lower Thames, which has been significantly dredged. But it's important to note in this region, as many other speakers have pointed out, this modern sort of sense of the river is not necessarily reflective at all of the ancient character of the river. Now, the early medieval river was likely broadly similar from between the 5th and 11th centuries. Not to say it hasn't changed, but it should be relatively similar. The further in time we go back, as we move through sort of to the Roman, Iron Age and Bronze Age, the river will become sort of increasingly alien to us, becoming wider, shallower, in places faster, and in other points slower, to a point that really using the modern river as an analog for the ancient one, arguably, is a very difficult or poor thing to do. Unfortunately, there's been no reconstruction of the River Thames at these periods, so we don't really have a very clear idea of what the ancient river would have looked like beyond very sort of general images that it would have been likely faster, likely shallower, but there's no real clear information on that. So unfortunately, I'd like to point it out as a bit of a limitation of this data set, it will have to make do. So if we take the 3,587 objects that can be attributed to the Middle Thames, plot them all into a sort of distribution, we can see that it's perhaps not the most helpful. The entirety of the Middle Thames contains abundances of finds. There are some clear sort of hotspots that emerge, but essentially they are sort of far too commonplace to actually be particularly useful. There are no regions which contain absolutely no finds, and therefore we sort of need to start to break this down before we can comment on it more meaningfully. Now, the rate of deposition changes massively between these periods. The number of finds recovered belonging to each period is wildly different. So we have our absolute peak from the Bronze Age, followed by a massive decline during the Iron Age. During the Roman period, this returns up to a similar level, though never quite near the peak. And then in the early medieval period, again, we do have more finds than in the Iron Age, but significantly less than in both the Bronze and the Roman period. And if we break that down further by sub-periods, we can see that the Bronze Age is relatively consistent. I'd also like to point out that on this graph and the following graphs, anything which is followed by or preceded with unknown simply refers to objects which, either due to condition or various other circumstances, can't be generally attributed to any one specific sub-period. But I've included them just to show that there is still large quantities of material. For example, the Roman material, huge amounts of that, typically pottery, cannot really be described as either early or late, or at least hasn't been. Much of it hasn't been retained. Therefore, to omit it would sort of provide an implication that there's very little deposition in the Roman period, but it's included just to sort of show that there. But again, as you can see, Iron Age period, we have an absolute fall, complete decline. In the Roman periods, we actually have the peak of individual deposited material. And then in the early medieval period, we see a relative peak in the later early medieval period. So it's a bit of an odd thing to say. But moving into sort of the composition of the overall data set. Right, so what this demonstrates is the relative proportions of each particular type of object related to various categories, be that weaponry, tools, personal ornaments, which includes jewelry, but it also includes things like buckles, belts, sort of any horse gear, bits and pieces like that, ingots and currency bars, which are only really particularly relevant to the Iron Age, followed by some pottery coins, and then other material, which generally refers to animal bone, though occasionally there are some unidentified objects that are thrown in, but the majority of that is entirely bone. What this really shows is overall it confirms that there is a massive abundance of weaponry throughout every major period other than Roman Britain. And in this Roman phase, there's actually only about 15 weapons that have been deposited across the entire study area, which shows a complete move away from any of the previous trends. The early medieval period, we see a complete return to sort of form, with large amounts of weapons being deposited. Tools are the next most significant category, though far more so in prehistory than in any later period. The Roman period is particularly significant because although there is a peak in the amount of material deposited during this period, it's completely different. Prestigious metalwork is not included at all. It is almost entirely coins and bulk finds of pottery. We'll sort of discuss this in a little bit more detail as we move on to period by period dynamics, but I'd like to discuss the distributions of weapons in a bit more detail. So previous speakers have mentioned that rivers are often seen as sort of sword places. There's a significance to rivers containing large amounts of swords. It's seen as the place where they tend to be recovered. In previous literature, swords are seen as generally belonging to wetland sort of areas, but rivers are the place to find them. This does not seem to be particularly true of the Middle Thames. Of the weaponry deposited, spearheads absolutely dominate the assemblage. Generally, they account for about at least 70% of each particular category, again, with the exception of the Roman period, which has very little weaponry at all. While swords are the next largest category, they only on average represent about 20% of all the weapons within the assemblage, where spears represent 80% of that. The other finds form minorities and really sort of just sort of exemplify patterns typical of each individual subperiod. So that's before we have swords in the early Bronze Age, we tend to see daggers instead, which begin to sort of phase out, though they are included in later periods. But this is really not necessarily completely typical of a British river, and certainly not typical of what previous expectations of the Thames had been led to believe by previous studies. Tools, again, sees an interesting distribution of objects. Axes dominate the assemblage throughout, particularly throughout prehistory. Pardon, sorry. Followed which we see knives are generally quite spread in their distribution, but overwhelmingly, the objects which are recovered here proportionally is almost entirely sort of axes, really. Other material that's quite significant to comment on are in the dark blue, sort of what you might consider working riverine tools. So these are things like fish hooks, net sinkers, fish traps, objects which generally you'd associate with people working with and living on the river, as opposed to anything that might have been brought to it or lost accidentally. So if we start to plot these individual periods in terms of their densities, we can start to see some more interesting patterns really starting to appear. So the major hotspots in the Bronze Age, shown here to be on the east of the Thames, is a region between Teddington, where the river turns tidal, and Kingston upon Thames. And this is the focal point of deposition. This accounts for the majority of finds recovered from the Middle Thames region. Another key area is this area between Maidenhead and Taplow, with Windsor just here and Reading over here. Whilst there are finds sort of evenly distributed across this, the significant clustering only seems to function in very particular locations. And these locations make a bit more sense when we start to look at the distributions of this in relation to the wider landscape. First, I'd just like to break down the Bronze Age in a little bit more detail. So as you can see through the early, middle, and then late Bronze Age, deposition, the rate of deposition intensifies, particularly in regard to weaponry. So more and more weapons are being deposited in each phase. The amount of tools peaks in the early Bronze Age, declining in the middle, but then slowly sort of starting to reappear. But proportionally, the majority, again, is weaponry, it is tools. There is very little other material really recovered during the Bronze Age. It's almost all prestige metalwork. This is undoubtedly partially recovery bias, but also certainly shows a different and unique way of interacting with the river. But if we compare this previous distribution against PAS and other stray finds on the left, against these distribution points, alongside burial centers, we start to see some interesting patterns emerging. So stray finds do not appear to show any particular correlation with focal points of riverine deposition. Instead, they are widely dispersed across each and every one of these locations. But the burials, they do show something quite interesting in that burials are not grouped particularly around any one deposition focus. The points are related to nearby, within about 1.5 kilometers, but not much closer than that. What perhaps is more significant is that each one of these clusters, regardless of intensity, is located to either an occupation site or a river crossing. So whilst we don't understand particularly well the location of fords in the Bronze Age, it's unlikely that crossing points that are known from documentary sources from early medieval and Roman sources will have moved that significantly over 3,000 years, which is a relatively, sounds like a lot, but it's a relatively short period of time morphologically for sort of discussions of rivers. The Iron Age sort of begins to intensify this patterning a little bit further. We see much clearer focal points beginning to develop. This is not unusual, considering wider Iron Age scholarship, which seems to indicate a movement towards cult places or sacred groves, any other location. But it's these focal points that really start to emerge. There's still a widespread pattern, but concentrations become far more dense. And that's very interesting given that the relative number of depositions drops an awful lot. The intensity and rate of deposition in the Iron Age is far lower than in the preceding and later periods. but at the same time, we see relatively stable patterns within what is actually being deposited. Weaponry is still abundant, tools are in a minority, increasing amounts of pottery are being deposited. And we see that there's relative stability between the early and later Iron Age, though much of this material has not been dated, which makes it very difficult to really comment on the apparent scarcity of Middle Iron Age finds. And if we compare these Iron Age distributions again to stray finds and burial sites, again, we can see that there is a focus of stray finds against these areas, which may just indicate increasing activity, but these finds are not riverine in nature. And then we have burial sites, which do not appear to share any real relationship at all with Iron Age finds. And again, returning to occupation sites, many of the depositional centers seen are located directly at focal points of river deposits, particularly hill forts and larger occupation sites. So similar to the Bronze Age, but becomes more developed in the distributions from the Roman period. So the Romano-British distributions, again, we can see similar patterns and the same sort of areas are starting to recur through time. But again, there's that concentrated focus. Now, these actually show an increasing number of finds sort of as we move into the later period, but it is an increasing number of finds of coins and pottery. Completely changes the depositional profile. There's almost no metalwork at all being deposited. And these areas are almost entirely focused around occupation sites with clusters of burials nearby. The relationship with stray finds, again, it's nothing significant. But if we look at large occupation centers and river crossings, we can see that these seem to directly relate to every major cluster of Roman finds during this period. Early medieval finds actually return to form of the sort of Bronze Age, essentially. We see increased dispersal. There are less focal points, and where there are focal points, they are far less intense. They also shift somewhat. So we see Reading return as a major focal point, with far less to the west of that up towards Goring and Streatley. But the focal point around Taplow and Maidenhead returns more intensively, actually moves slightly north towards Cookham. We then see Old Windsor emerging as the focal point of early material on the Middle Thames, where the majority of finds are recovered. And again, there is sporadic finds between there through stains through the Shepperton Ranges up to Kingston upon Thames and Teddington. And looking at this more closely, we again see complete return to the previous dominance of weaponry. Tools become almost non-existent, but the weapon deposits almost exclusively belong to the later early medieval period or Viking period between 10th and 11th centuries. The material here, pardon, this is the most exclusive of every sub-period. It's almost entirely weaponry, with very little of anything else really significantly recovered. And again, if we compare that to stray finds and burial sites, stray finds do not appear to cluster particularly well with any of the major river clusters other than perhaps Cookham, though this again is likely recovery biases. And then burial sites do cluster around some of the more western clusters of these finds. But we do see a complete lack of relationship there in the east, whereas there is far more consistency in early medieval population centers and river crossings. So what this data really starts to demonstrate is that the only real consistent relationship that all of these sub-periods demonstrate is that clusters of river points are found at crossings. This has been something that has been assumed for a very long time, but it's never really been demonstrated through sort of long term. It also has some interesting points in relation to the current sort of questions of mobility. And in terms of if these deposits are perhaps votive, it's very interesting that people don't seem to be traveling very far to put anything into the river. These are all near sort of large populations, well-traveled routes. They're not in these liminal spaces that are often sort of approached through prehistory. The river's relationship seems to be far more mundane than that. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't also be votive, but it certainly removes some of that mystifying element that we particularly see in discussions of British prehistory. So just to finish, I'd just like to point out that the Middle Thames is particularly noticeable for there's an abundance of weaponry, which is to be expected of rivers, though it is very unusual that swords just do not seem to be present within the assemblage at all. They are replaced almost entirely by spears. There's a sort of gradual long-term decline of tools within the assemblage, which in prehistory is often not assumed to be the case. And we see significant changes in depositional behavior in certain periods compared to others, particularly in the Iron Age and Roman period. These changes are different per period. The Iron Age maintains the same relative proportions as the Bronze Age, but the rate of deposition drops massively. And then the Roman period completely changes what's happening at all with rivers. The relationship completely shifts, followed to a return to form in the early medieval period, which has been posited in previous studies, and the significance of the Middle Thames has been suggested, but it's never before been demonstrated through actually plotting all of the finds that we have available. But what's particularly interesting in terms of the distribution is the same through areas crop up as focal points across sort of all of these periods. Reading, Windsor, the strait between Taplow and Maidenhead, and the stretches between Kingston and Teddington. And this is likely linked to the fact that these are and have been major and stable crossing points throughout all of these periods, which may have cemented their place within a sort of ritual landscape around the river, if these finds are thought to be votive. But it also suggests that perhaps some of the finds that we do attribute to be votive, it may not be a ritual or religious significance in the way that we expect, with a liminal, strange place as an offering to gods. It could be far more sort of incorporated into mundane life. The distinction between ritual and non-ritual finds might not be as important as we sort of have been led to believe. So thank you.